The pattern nobody wanted to acknowledge began quietly, almost invisibly, in the shadow of the new millennium. A subtle rise, a statistical tremor, a psychological shift that analysts would later suggest signaled something much deeper than personal anguish. By the time the numbers settled, the suicide rate in modern nations was up 30% since 2000, and for people aged 10 to 34, it had become the second leading cause of death. Here's what nobody tells you. Behind every major societal turning point, every economic boom, every technological revelation, every cultural swing, there is a hidden psychological cost, one that tends to reveal itself only years later. And that's where this story begins. To connect this to the viewer's world, you only have to look at the past 2 decades of household pressures. Rising living costs outpacing wages. Student debt climbing into the trillions. Social media turning personal comparison into a 24-hour loop. Analysts argue these forces may not directly cause crisis, but they shape the psychological architecture in which crisis thrives. And history shows, again and again, that when economic expectations shift faster than emotional stability can adapt, a generation finds itself under a weight it never trained to carry. This is where the pattern begins. Look back at 1930, when economic collapse eroded communal confidence and psychological instability surged across multiple nations. In 1974, during the oil crisis, researchers documented sharp increases in despair, linked behaviors tied to job loss and inflation. In 1997, after the Asian financial crisis, several countries reported spikes in mental distress that paralleled currency collapses. Each time, the same cycle appeared. Financial shocks created emotional aftershocks, which then produced long, quiet psychological consequences. But the modern rise, starting around 2000, didn't follow the rhythm of a single economic disaster. It followed something more insidious, a cultural shift powered by technology, isolation, identity fragmentation, and the pressure to perform. And the question that looms over everything, one we will only resolve in Section 2, is this. If all these forces were converging simultaneously, what hidden mechanism could drive such a dramatic, age-specific escalation? For now, let me show you exactly how this began. At first, the early 2000s looked like a miracle. Digital connectivity promised connection. The global economy expanded. College attendance soared. But analysts later noted something strange. Indicators of psychological resilience, communal bonds, long-term stability expectations, intergenerational support structures were quietly deteriorating. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. Because beneath the surface, a new form of psychological pressure was forming, one that was subtle enough to ignore but powerful enough to reshape an entire generation's emotional landscape. Here's why this matters. Pressures that are invisible are often more dangerous than pressures that are loud. By the time society recognizes them, they're already embedded. The origin point sits somewhere between economic structure and cultural identity. Around 2000, childhood and adolescence began transforming in ways no previous era had witnessed. The rise of digital life meant identities became fragmented across offline and online worlds. What used to be temporary social mistakes became permanent digital artifacts. Analysts studying the period argued that for ages 10-34, life was no longer a private learning process. It was a public performance, not growth, exposure. And then came the economic layer. Between 2000 and 2020, housing costs in many major cities rose dramatically faster than median income. Student debt ballooned, job security decreased. Young adults entered an economy that demanded long hours, constant availability, and relentless competitiveness. Here's the mechanism. Expectations grew faster than stability. People were asked to do more, earn more, achieve more, display more, yet were given fewer structural supports to catch them when they fell. At first, it looked like an opportunity-driven society. Then the bill arrived. This is where historians trace the early warning signs. Surveys from the mid-2000s recorded rising levels of reported emotional strain among adolescents. Studies suggested weakening resilience markers by 2008. But the danger wasn't what they saw. It was what they ignored. Because society was still functioning, the economy was still expanding, and innovation still soared, Leaders assumed the psychological cost was negligible. But mental instability doesn't erupt instantly. It accumulates silently, year after year, until the structure bearing its weight finally cracks. To understand the scale of this shift, we need to revisit one major historical anchor: the cultural transition of the late 20th century. In the 1960s and 70s, communities were dense. Families lived multi-generationally, and friend groups were locally rooted. By contrast, the early 2000s ushered in an era where mobility replaced rootedness, digital networks replaced physical interaction, and constant comparison replaced gradual identity formation. Here's what nobody tells you. Psychological stability, historically, was built not on individual strength, but on collective reinforcement. Remove the collective, and the individual stands alone against pressures they were never designed to face alone. And that's where the modern escalation enters the story. Between 2000 and 2019, data showed a steady upward climb in reported emotional strain across adolescents and young adults. Analysts didn't view this as a collapse but as an accumulation, a slow pressure build, not a sudden explosion, a tightening. But then came the accelerators. The shift toward algorithm-driven communication reshaped how young people understood themselves. Posts became metrics. Friendships became quantifiable. Expression became competition. And while many adapted, others experienced a type of psychological fragmentation that historical records suggest did not exist at this scale in earlier generations. Let me show you exactly how this fragmentation works. A young person in 1980 compared themselves to a few dozen peers. A young person in 2020 compares themselves to thousands, filtered, edited, curated versions of thousands. Analysts propose that this comparison pressure can act like a silent erosion of resilience. Not overnight destruction, gradual weakening, day by day, post by post, year by year, and the economic layer returned, heavier than before. The 2008 financial crisis didn't just eliminate jobs, it eliminated expectations of stability. Several economists argue that one scenario suggests this event may have reshaped an entire generation's psychological relationship with the future. People aged 10-34 grew up absorbing the message that security was temporary, opportunity was fragile, and failure was catastrophic. Combine that with rising rent, rising tuition, and rising social pressure, and analysts found themselves confronting a pattern that felt historically familiar, but modernly intensified. Here's where the pattern begins to solidify. In the past, crises were discrete: wars, depressions, or epidemics. But the modern psychological landscape is shaped not by single shocks, but by continuous micropressures with no defined end. Economic uncertainty, social media comparison, cultural fragmentation, loneliness, identity volatility, all hitting the same age range at the same time. Not crisis, saturation. This brings us to the deeper, hidden force, one that historians trace across civilizations but rarely name explicitly: the psychological cost of rapid societal transformation. Every time a society changes faster than its emotional institutions can adapt, there is fallout, quiet, invisible, but real. Ancient Athens documented despair-linked behaviors during periods of political upheaval. Industrial Revolution Britain recorded spikes during rapid urbanization. Japan in the 1990s faced a similar pattern as social norms shifted under economic stagnation. None of these events mirror the modern world exactly, but they form a lineage, a chain of historical signals whispering the same warning. When the pace of change exceeds the pace of emotional adaptation, instability follows. Everyone thought modern innovation would create happier lives. It created faster lives. And faster lives demand faster minds, minds that analysts argue may not always keep pace with the environment shaping them. The danger wasn't the new technologies, nor the new economics, nor the new cultural norms. It was the intersection of all three, converging on the same demographic, at the same moment, with unprecedented intensity. And that brings us to the final moments of Section 1, the point where the pattern reveals its hidden architecture. If the suicide rate rose 30% since 2000, and if the age group 10-34 became the second most affected, then the crisis cannot be explained by individual suffering alone. It must be understood as a structural psychological event, one shaped by forces that operate quietly, continuously, and without clear boundaries. The question now is not what happened. The question is what mechanism drove the convergence. And to answer that, we must step deeper into the unseen machinery shaping modern emotional life, the mechanism that analysts suggest may be operating quietly beneath the surface of modern society. We'll expose that machinery next. The hidden psychological machinery behind the modern rise didn't emerge from a single event. It emerged from a convergence: economic pressure, cultural speed, digital identity, and the quiet erosion of stability forming something new. Something analysts now describe as an ambient weight pressing on the youngest generation. Here's the mechanism. When multiple small stresses act continuously on a society, they compound into a force far greater than any single shock. Not an explosion. A tide. Slow, rising, and difficult to perceive until you're already standing waist-deep in it. To understand how this convergence escalated into a 30% rise in suicide rates since 2000, and how it became the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 34, we need to examine the evolution of the forces shaping the modern emotional landscape. Because at first glance, it appears as though everything simply became harder for individuals. But the deeper structure tells a different story. Not individual fragility, but systemic pressure. The evolution began with identity. In earlier eras, identity was anchored to community, region, tradition, and family. These anchors created slow-changing roles and expectations. But the digital world replaced these anchors with something fluid, fast, and infinitely comparative. Analysts suggest that identity, once stable, became a shifting target, one defined by feedback loops instead of personal experience. At first, this new landscape looked empowering. People could express themselves across platforms, connect globally, build communities around interests, and present their best selves. Then the bill arrived. Digital identity carried with it something unexpected: surveillance of the self by the self. Posts needed likes, images needed validation, accomplishments needed visibility, and the pressure to maintain a public-facing persona turned internal expression into performance. Everyone thought the connectivity would bring unity. It brought visibility, and visibility can fracture the mind. But identity was only the first layer. The second layer was economic precarity. Young adults entered a world where wages stagnated while living costs soared. Analysts studying housing trends noted that by the 2010s, monthly rent in major cities consumed far more income than it had in the 1980s or 1990s. Student debt surged. Gig work replaced stable employment, and job competition intensified. One scenario suggests that the psychological effect of living in a state of permanent uncertainty, never fully secure, never fully settled, created a baseline tension that was easy to overlook but impossible to escape. This tension didn't scream. It whispered. Every day. Every hour. Here's what nobody tells you. Psychological crises rarely originate in dramatic events. They build through accumulation. And the modern economic environment created a long-term accumulation cycle unlike any seen before. Then came the third layer: isolation. Despite living in the most connected era in history, analysts observed that reported loneliness rose dramatically across the same time period. People communicated more but experienced fewer meaningful interactions. Digital friendships lacked physical presence. Urban mobility fragmented long-term community ties. And social comparison, amplified by curated lives online, made people feel more alone even when surrounded by others. Not isolation by distance. Isolation by contrast. This type of isolation is subtle. It doesn't feel like being completely alone. It feels like being surrounded by others who appear happier, more accomplished, and more connected. The psychological effect is not emptiness, it's inadequacy. The danger wasn't what young people lacked, it was what they believed everyone else possessed. These three forces, identity fragmentation, economic precarity, and contrast-driven isolation, created the early structure. But the final layer is what turned the structure into a trap. Here's the trap. Modern societies optimized for performance instead of stability. Productivity became a moral value. Output became identity. Silence about struggle became the norm. And analysts suggest this cultural emphasis may have discouraged many from acknowledging emotional distress early enough to seek help. Pressure became a badge, not a warning. This is the part of the mechanism that few notice. A culture that celebrates resilience can unintentionally punish vulnerability. And when vulnerability becomes stigmatized, suffering becomes invisible. At first, this high-performance culture looked like ambition. Then the long-term consequences surfaced. People internalized expectations that were never meant to be carried alone. They were told to strive continuously, adapt endlessly, and improve constantly, without recognizing the emotional cost of relentless self-optimization. Not rest, hustle, not presence, productivity, not meaning, metrics. And further complicating the landscape, analysts noticed something striking. The rise in suicide rates did not affect all age groups evenly. The most dramatic increases appeared in younger cohorts. This suggests, according to several researchers, that modern pressures may interact differently with developing identities, creating vulnerability points that did not exist in previous generations. Here's why this matters. Young people between 10 and 34 are in the 2-decade window when identity solidifies, economic paths begin, and relationships shape long-term emotional health. When this window is filled with instability, the impact can be profound. But to fully understand who pays the price of this system, we need to examine each group within the affected demographic. For adolescents, the hidden danger appears in the transition between childhood and self-definition. Analysts studying this stage note that the combination of online identity, academic pressure, and rapidly shifting social landscapes creates conditions of chronic cognitive overload. Not trauma, overload. Continuous micro-decisions, micro-comparisons, micro-stresses, no single one powerful enough to break a person, but together capable of reshaping emotional baselines. For young adults entering the workforce, the pressure emerges from another angle: unpredictability. Jobs are uncertain. Housing is unstable. Relationships are transient. Analysts suggest that emotional scaffolding weakens when life becomes a sequence of temporary arrangements. Without stable anchors, long-term employment, affordable housing, predictable paths, psychological resilience is forced to carry more than it was designed to bear. For those approaching their late 20s and early 30s, the issue shifts again. Here, the psychological cost comes from divergence between expectation and reality. Generational narratives promise success through hard work, homes, families, stability. But many reached this age to find those milestones out of reach. According to some researchers, the emotional weight of unmet expectations may act as a cumulative stressor, amplifying despair during periods of personal uncertainty. Everyone thought the problem was individual weakness. It wasn't. It was an environment demanding emotional strength without providing emotional infrastructure. And now comes the hardest question, the one we opened in Section 1 and can finally begin resolving. What mechanism connects all these pressures into a single rising trend? The answer, analysts propose, lies in compounding psychological load. Not one cause, many, not one shock. Thousands, not one crisis. Continuous pressure without recovery. The human mind evolved for cycles, stress and rest, pressure and relief, but modern life created a near-permanent state of activation. Notifications, deadlines, obligations, comparisons, expectations, digital presence, economic uncertainty, cultural acceleration, all occurring simultaneously without interruption. Here's the mechanism in full. Modern society removed recovery periods from the emotional cycle. Historical communities offered decompression, communal rituals, shared burdens, slower cultural rhythms. But as the pace of society accelerated, recovery time vanished. Young people found themselves living in a world where their psychological baseline never reset. And analysts argue that one scenario suggests this constant activation may correlate with rising emotional strain across the youngest cohorts. Who benefits from this structure? The productivity economy, the attention economy, the speed economy. Who pays? The individuals navigating an emotional landscape that moves faster than their developmental wiring. And that leads us to the final layer of this story, the place where these pressures finally converge. Young people today face not just rapid change, but continuous change. Not just comparison, but global comparison. Not just uncertainty, but structural uncertainty. Not just performance culture, but performative identity. These forces do not merely coexist, they reinforce one another. And when reinforcement becomes pressure, and pressure becomes chronic, the emotional cost becomes visible in statistics that should have shocked the world far earlier. But here's what nobody tells you. The rise is not destiny. Analysts propose multiple future scenarios, each shaped by how societies respond to these hidden forces. Scenario 1. Stabilization through awareness. If institutions, families, schools, and workplaces learn to recognize and reduce chronic psychological load, analysts argue that rates could stabilize. Cultural norms might shift toward rest, connection, and meaningful interaction rather than performance. Scenario 2. Fragmentation and divergence. If pressures continue accelerating at their current rate, one scenario suggests that different groups may experience sharply different psychological outcomes. Some will adapt, others will fracture. The gap between the emotionally supported and the unsupported could widen. Scenario 3. Structural relief. If economic and social reforms improve stability, affordable housing, accessible mental health care, reduced economic precarity, the underlying pressures could diminish. Not instantly, but gradually the emotional atmosphere could normalize. We do not end with certainty. Modern issues never offer that, but we end with clarity. The forces shaping this generation are not invisible anymore. They are identifiable, measurable, and addressable, if societies choose to confront them. The hidden architecture behind the rising numbers is not a mystery. It is a structure, and structures can be rebuilt.